The Zelthar Dominion was no stranger to conquest. For centuries their war fleets had crushed civilizations, their empire stretching across entire star clusters. Worlds that once resisted now bore their banners, their people assimilated into servitude. Resistance was a concept the Zelthar barely acknowledged anymore. When they arrived, submission was inevitable. Their technology outmatched nearly every species they encountered. Their strategies had been perfected over hundreds of years of interstellar war. And their fleets? Unstoppable. At least, that was the belief within the Dominion's high command. When their deep space sensors picked up an unidentified vessel in the farthest reaches of an unclaimed sector, the fleet stationed nearby barely took notice. It was a single ship, broadcasting human identification codes. No fleet, no reinforcements, nothing to suggest it was anything more than an exploratory vessel or a border patrol. The Dominion had never fought humans before. They had heard of them, of course, an upstart species expanding outward from the Sol system, establishing colonies at a respectable pace. But they were small, insignificant, another species of soft-bodied primates that had only recently reached the stars. The Zelthar had dominated species far older and more advanced. Humans? They were nothing. Aboard the Zelthar flagship, a Leviathan-class battlecruiser adorned with war trophies from a dozen conquered worlds, Fleet Commander Vorkal barely acknowledged the report when it was first brought to him. A lone human vessel barely large enough to classify as a proper warship? Hardly worth his time. Another primitive species testing the edges of our dominion, one of his sub-commanders remarked, glancing at the data feed. The human vessel was holding position near a mineral-rich asteroid belt, likely a scouting or survey ship. Its hull was angular, reinforced with thick plating that lacked the elegant curvature of Zelthar designs, a relic from a bygone era, as far as they were concerned. "Should we send a warning?" an officer asked. Vorkal smirked, leaning back in his command throne. "No need. They'll either leave or die." Still, protocol demanded an official warning. A standard transmission was sent, the same ultimatum the Dominion had used 1,000 times before. "Unidentified human vessel, you are trespassing in Zelthar-claimed space. Power down your weapons and surrender immediately. Non-compliance will be met with force. You will not receive another warning." Seconds passed. The fleet remained on high alert, though no one truly expected a fight. Most species, when confronted by the Dominion, surrendered. Those foolish enough to resist were wiped out before their distress calls could even reach Allied forces. Then, a response came. It was brief, cold, uncomplicated. "Turn back, or be destroyed." The command deck of the flagship fell into silence. Then, laughter. A ripple of amusement spread through the officers. Was this a joke? Did they actually say that? One officer scoffed, shaking his head. "Arrogant. Little creatures," another muttered. "They must think they have some kind of advantage." Vorkal chuckled, his sharp predatory fangs flashing in the dim glow of the holographic display. He had encountered many species in his long and decorated military career, but this was new. Most species pleaded for their lives. Others tried to negotiate, offering resources or territory in exchange for their survival. But this human ship? It had threatened them. "They actually think they have a chance," Vorkal mused, his amusement giving way to cruel anticipation. He studied the human vessel, analyzing its size, its outdated weapons array, its lack of any visible support fleet. It was pathetic. This was not a warship. It was a challenge, a pathetic, misguided challenge. Vorkal did not tolerate challenges. With a casual wave of his hand, he gave the order. "Target the human ship, fire at will." Across the Zelthar fleet, weapons systems came to life, plasma batteries cycling, up and ion cannons locking onto the lone human vessel. The Dominion had raised entire planets in hours. Wiping out a single warship would not take minutes. But as the first shots streaked across the void, something unexpected happened. The human warship moved. It did not turn to flee. It did not activate distress beacons. It did not even raise its shields. It did something far worse. It stood its ground, and the Zelthar had no idea what was about to happen next. The Zelthar fleet had never known fear. From the moment they took To the stars, their dominion had expanded like an unstoppable tide. Their warships were the embodiment of destruction, their military doctrines simple yet effective. Overwhelm, annihilate, conquer. Against species with less developed technology, their brute force tactics had been more than enough. They did not need strategy. They did not need caution. They simply crushed anything in their path. So, when the human ship refused to retreat, the fleet commander, Vorkal, was not concerned. If anything, he was amused. On his command, the first volley was unleashed. From the Zelthar battle line, warships large enough to blacken the skies of a planet fired in perfect synchronization. Plasma lances, ionized bolts, and kinetic rounds streaked across the void toward the lone human vessel. To the Zelthar, this was routine. Their weapons had cracked open the fortresses of species far older than humanity. They had melted entire armadas into floating wreckage. And yet as the first shots neared their target, something was wrong. The human ship did not raise shields. It did not deploy countermeasures. It simply moved, not a desperate maneuver. Not an uncoordinated scramble for safety. It was precise, calculated, impossible. With inhuman reflexes, the ship shifted its position at a sharp angle, executing a maneuver that should have torn its hull apart under normal physics. The first wave of plasma fire streaked past, missing by mere meters. The human warship banked, twisted, and accelerated in a way that no vessel of its mass should have been able to. And in that moment, the Zelthar realized their first mistake. This was no outdated relic, no primitive patrol ship stumbling into hostile space. This ship had baited them. The Zelthar officers stared at their screens, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Their weapons had been locked onto the target with 99.8% accuracy, and yet they had missed. Impossible, one of the gunnery officers muttered, adjusting the targeting parameters. No ship that size should be able to. It's accelerating, another voice interrupted, his tone shifting from confusion to urgency. Vorkal narrowed his gaze at the tactical display. The human vessel had gone from a stationary position to nearly twice the acceleration limits of a Dominion warship, and it was closing the distance. The Zelthar fleet had expected a slow, cumbersome target. Instead, they were watching something move with terrifying efficiency. A silence fell over the command deck, a creeping unease settling into the minds of every officer present. This was not how battles were supposed to go. The Zelthar dictated engagements. They crushed their enemies beneath superior numbers and firepower. But now, for the first time, they were reacting, adjusting, and Vorkal hated it. "Redirect all batteries," he snapped. "Focus fire. Do not let it close the distance." Another wave of plasma and kinetic rounds erupted from the fleet. This time, the human ship did not merely dodge, it counterattacked. Without warning, the void between the fleets flashed white. Single, searing beam of energy lanced out from the human vessel. For a fraction of a second, the Zelthar officers thought it was some kind of experimental weapon, a desperate last strike from an outmatched opponent. But then, the beam connected, and one of their cruisers simply ceased to exist. The vessel, a heavily armored Zelthar warship over 3 kilometers long, vanished in an instant. There was no explosion, no fireball. It was simply erased. A shocked silence filled the command deck. Weapons officers scrambled to analyze the data. Engineers checked for malfunctions in their sensors. Some of them refused to believe what they had just seen. But Vorkal? He was staring at the wreckage. There was no debris, no lingering energy signature. The cruiser had been vaporized in a way that defied everything he knew about starship combat. His claws dug into the armrest of his command throne. "Status report," he growled. One of his officers hesitated before answering. "Sir, our readings indicate that the energy output from that weapon was—" He stopped, as if struggling to process the numbers. It was beyond anything we've ever encountered. Vorkal felt the beginnings of something unfamiliar creeping into his chest, a cold weight, a feeling he had not experienced in decades. It was not anger. It was fear, but he crushed it down. This was still a human ship, still an inferior species. It could be destroyed. It had to be destroyed. Full fleet. "Assault," he ordered, his voice sharp. "I want every ship firing at maximum capacity. Do not let it fire again. And yet, as the Zelthar prepared for their next strike, the human ship made its move. It wasn't fleeing. It was charging straight toward them. And that was when the Zelthar fleet realized their second mistake. They had thought they were the hunters, but, in that moment, as the human warship accelerated with a speed that defied all logic, they realized they were the prey, and it was too late to run. A warship was never supposed to move like that. The Zelthar fleet had fought against dozens of species, crushed entire civilizations beneath their might, and burned worlds that dared to resist. They knew war. They had perfected it. Their battle formations were honed through centuries of conquest, their ships built for sheer overwhelming destruction. But now, they were witnessing something they could neither explain nor counter. The human warship was moving like a predator. It had dodged their opening salvo with inhuman precision. It had erased one of their cruisers with a single, horrifyingly efficient weapon, and now it was coming straight for them. On the bridge of his command ship, Fleet Commander Vorkal felt a sharp tension coiling in his chest. Not fear. Not yet. But something dangerously close to it. Target that ship with every available weapon, he barked, his voice cutting through the tense silence on the bridge. I want missile volleys, plasma barrages, everything! The order was unnecessary. His officers had already begun rerouting power, their hands flying across their consoles as they adjusted firing solutions. The Zelthar did not hesitate in war. A heartbeat later, the space between the two forces erupted into chaos. The sky was burning. Thousands of plasma bolts surged forward, a storm of energy that would have obliterated entire fleets in seconds. Missiles screamed through the void, each armed with warheads capable of cracking planetary crusts. Kinetic rounds, massive hunks of hyper-accelerated tungsten, ripped through the darkness at near-relativistic speeds. It was the kind of firepower that had reduced civilizations to ruins, and yet the human warship danced. It didn't just evade, it moved like a living thing, shifting in ways that defied all logic, as though it saw the attacks before they happened. A plasma barrage capable of turning a moon into slag hurtled toward it, only for the ship to tilt at the last possible second, skimming past the fiery storm as though it had been choreographed. Missiles locked onto its trajectory. But then the ship twisted impossibly fast, making them miss by mere meters. No ship should have been able to do this. Zelthar targeting systems were designed to predict movement patterns based on mass, momentum, and propulsion physics. But the human vessel did not follow any known physics. It was unpredictable. It shouldn't have been possible. And yet, the proof was right there, dodging everything they threw at it. And then, it counterattacked. A single bright flash erupted from its hull. Not a missile, not a laser barrage. It was a lance of pure energy, and it was aimed with terrifying precision. The Zelthar battleship Lorcan's Wrath was one of the mightiest vessels in the fleet. Its armor had withstood supernova shockwaves, asteroid impacts, and the relentless onslaught of 100 war campaigns. None of it mattered. The beam struck, and Lorcan's Wrath was erased. No explosion, no debris. One moment, the 4-kilometer-long dreadnought was there. The next, gone. The Zelthar bridge crew froze. Vorkal felt his claws tighten on his command chair. The impossible had happened again. We lost Lorcan's Wrath, a trembling officer stammered. It had been one of the fleet's most powerful ships, and yet the human vessel had simply erased it with a single shot. What kind of weapon is that? Another officer demanded, panic creeping into his tone. Their sensors had barely registered the attack before the dreadnought was gone. No known energy signature matched the readings. It wasn't plasma. It wasn't a standard beam weapon. It was something else entirely, something beyond Zelthar understanding. And now, the human ship was still closing in. Fast. The Zelthar fleet wasn't used to being the ones in danger. They were always the predators, the destroyers, never the prey, and yet they were now running out of time. Reroute fleet formation, Vorkal snapped, his voice dangerously sharp. Surround that ship! I want it boxed in from all sides! His fleet moved instantly. Warships, battleships, and interceptors swarmed forward in a coordinated formation, designed to trap enemies in a tightening noose of firepower. It was an overwhelming strategy. Nothing had ever survived it before. But the human warship, it did not hesitate. It saw the noose closing, and instead of pulling back, it accelerated straight into the heart of the formation. A challenge. A direct challenge. The Zelthar warships opened fire with everything they had, and still, it was not enough. The human vessel weaved through the gaps, slipping past plasma bolts, dodging missiles as if it had predicted every single shot before they had even fired. And then, it began tearing through their ranks. Another bright flash. A Zelthar destroyer, barely a kilometer from the lead battleship, vanished. Another shot, a warship shattered apart as the beam ripped clean through its core, its remains spiraling into the abyss. And then another. And another. In the span of seconds, the Zelthar fleet was shrinking. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" The words left Vorkal's mouth before he even realized it. A silence fell over the bridge. His officers, hardened warriors of the Dominion, were pale with disbelief. The human warship came to a halt, its glowing weapon cooling, its movements controlled. Precise. Fearless. Vorkal's breathing was slow. This wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. And in that moment, a realization settled over him like a lead weight. They had made a mistake. A terrible mistake. The Zelthar had assumed they were the apex predators of this galaxy. But this ship, this human ship, was something else. Something far, far worse. And now, for the first time in his long career, Fleet Commander Vorkal felt something he had never thought possible. Dread. Because as the human warship slowly turned to face him, its next target clear, he finally understood. This wasn't just an engagement. This was a warning. And they had ignored it. Fleet Commander Vorkal could hear the silence on his bridge. It was a suffocating, paralyzing thing, thick with disbelief, edged with terror. The kind of silence that followed. The unthinkable. The kind that came when warriors, conquerors, and executioners realized they had become the prey. He could see it in his officers' faces. Their hands hovered over controls, their eyes flickered between displays, but no one spoke. No one moved. It wasn't fear. Not yet, but something dangerously close to it. The human warship had done the impossible. It had danced through their volleys with an unnatural grace, avoiding thousands of high-speed projectiles as though it had known where they would be before they were even fired. It had erased one of the Dominion's mightiest battleships, not destroyed, not crippled, but erased. Gone without a trace. And now it was coming for them. The remaining Zelthar ships were caught. Between instinct and logic, their training dictated that they continue the assault, press the attack, overwhelm the enemy with superior numbers. But instinct screamed at them. It whispered the undeniable truth. The more they fought, the more they would die. The human warship had not sustained a single hit. Not one. "Commander," one of his officers spoke at last, voice tight with unease. "Our firepower is proving ineffective. I advise tactical retreat." Retreat. The word alone was an insult to the Dominion. The Zelthar had never needed to retreat before. Their fleets had broken the backs of empires. They had conquered entire species, bent them to their will, reduced worlds to ashes. And now? Now they were considering fleeing from a single warship? Vorkal's claws tightened against the armrests of his command. Chair, unacceptable. Yet, was there a choice? His mind raced, processing the impossible variables. What kind of technology were the humans using? No energy readings matched anything known to the Dominion. That weapon, it had erased ships without leaving debris. Even antimatter weaponry left, something behind. This was different, and it was beyond them. For the first time in his long, decorated career, Vorkal felt something cold press against his chest. A sensation he had once considered beneath him. Doubt. But before he could act, before he could issue a single command, the human warship moved again. Faster than before, too fast. It wasn't just maneuvering. It was closing the distance, a calculated move, a predator closing in for the kill. "Incoming!" someone barked. Vorkal barely had time to process the warning before his ship lurched violently. The human warship had fired again. Not at them, at the ships around them. In the span of a breath, another battleship ceased to exist. One moment, it had been there. Crew scrambling, shields reinforced. And then it was gone. A void remained in its place, as if the ship had never been there to begin with. Another flash. A warship split apart as something carved through its hull, not melted, not shattered, but severed cleanly. A perfect, impossible cut. Screams erupted over the comms. The Zelthar fleet was fracturing. Centuries of dominance had never prepared them for this. They had never encountered an enemy that outmatched them so completely. This was not war. This was slaughter. "Commander, we must retreat," another officer insisted, his voice tight with barely restrained panic. Retreat. A word that meant weakness. A word that meant surrender. But Vorkal was no fool. He could see the truth etched into the battlefield. The Zelthar had already lost. Another flash. Another ship. Gone. The human warship was hunting them, one by one, and it wasn't stopping. All ships, disengage, break formation, and retreat. Vorkal bellowed, slamming his fist onto the command console. Now! The order was unprecedented. His officers hesitated, stunned, unable to process what they had just heard. But then another warship vanished, and hesitation died. Engines roared. To life. The once coordinated formation broke apart as vessels twisted and banked, racing toward deep space, desperate to put distance between themselves and the nightmare they had just unleashed. But the human ship did not allow it. It was faster, more than once. The Zelthar had prided themselves on the speed of their warships. Their engines were designed for swift planetary assaults and rapid redeployments. No species had ever outpaced them. But this ship, it was something else. It surged forward, cutting through the fleet like a phantom, unstoppable, relentless. Vorkal's own flagship shuddered as it pushed its engines beyond safety limits. They were running, they were fleeing, and the human warship was still watching. Its weapons had gone silent. For now. It had done enough. It had sent its message. And as the remaining Zelthar ships limped away, fractured and defeated, Vorkal understood something that chilled him to the core. This had never been a battle. It had been a demonstration, and the Zelthar Dominion had been chosen as the example. The galaxy had changed today. The apex predators of the stars had just learned a terrifying truth. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. Fleet Commander Vorkal had never known true silence before now. It wasn't the silence of deep space, the hollow void between the stars. It wasn't the disciplined hush of warriors standing at attention. No, this was something else. It was the silence of defeat. The bridge of his once proud flagship, the nerve center of a Zelthar war fleet, had never been this quiet, not in all his years of command. The officers sat rigid at their stations, claws gripping consoles, jaws clenched in silent shame. No one dared to speak. No one dared to acknowledge what had just happened. The Zelthar Dominion had never been forced to retreat. Never. Yet here they were, running like cowards, fleeing across the black void, their fleet shattered, their strongest, warships erased from existence as if they had never been. And the cause of their humiliation? A single human warship. Vorkal clenched his fists so tightly that his armored gauntlets creaked in protest. His pulse thundered in his skull, his twin hearts hammering against his chest. The humans had done something no species in the galaxy had ever accomplished. They had humbled the Dominion, and worse, they had let them live. A cold, unbearable realization settled into Vorkal's mind like a parasite burrowing into flesh. This had been intentional. The human warship could have destroyed every last one of them. It could have wiped them out to the last ship. But it hadn't. It had let them run. A message, a warning, and that was far worse than annihilation, because now the truth would spread. Across the Dominion, across the entire galaxy. The Zelthar had been broken, the apex predators of the stars, humbled. The thought burned, it boiled his blood. But before he could even process the weight of their defeat, a shrill alarm pierced the silence. A sensor officer snapped to attention. His voice was strained, tight with barely contained panic. "Commander, it's still there." Vorkal's head snapped toward the main view screen. His eyes narrowed, and there it was. The human warship. It had not pursued them. It had not fired again. It simply existed. A distant, unmoving phantom in the void. A ship that had shattered their fleet yet showed no interest in chasing them down. It wasn't hunting them, because it didn't need to. It had already won. And now, it simply watched. Like a predator watching wounded prey limp away. Vorkal felt something unfamiliar curl in his gut. Something foreign. Something that made his spines bristle and his fangs clench together. Dread. Because deep down, beneath the rage and humiliation, he understood. That ship, whatever it was, whatever terrible technology it wielded, had not been sent to wage war. It had been sent to make a statement, and they had understood it perfectly. The Zelthar Dominion had ruled with fear. They had conquered worlds, shattered fleets, burned civilizations to the ground, and now they had just been given a taste of their own terror. A quiet, suffocating horror settled across the bridge. None of his officers dared to look at the screen. None of them wanted to see that lone warship still waiting in the darkness, still watching, and, the worst part, it had not spoken a single word. It didn't need to, because its actions had said everything. The Dominion was no longer the apex power of the stars. Humanity had arrived, and the galaxy would never be the same. The bridge of the Zelthar command vessel was drowning in a suffocating silence. No one spoke. No one moved. The officers stationed at their posts had once carried themselves with unshakable confidence, their species' legacy of conquest woven into their very bones. They were descendants of warriors, the elite of the Dominion's naval forces, conquerors of 100 star systems, and yet, at this moment, they looked like cornered animals. Fleet Commander Vorkal remained at the command dais, his clawed hands gripping the armrests of his throne-like chair so tightly that the metal plating groaned under the pressure. His mandibles twitched, his twin hearts hammering inside his chest like war drums. The human warship was still there. A lone shadow, in the void, its cold, featureless hull gleaming faintly against the distant light of a dying star. A ghost in the darkness. For what? Vorkal did not know. It had allowed them to flee, humiliated and broken. Yet it had not left. It had made no further aggressive moves. There had been no transmissions, no demands, no ultimatums. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. The Zelthar knew war. They had built their empire upon the ruins of the weak. They understood the language of violence, of power, of fleets crashing against one another in brutal, merciless slaughter. But this was something else. Something far worse. Psychological warfare. They had never been on the receiving end of it before. The silence, the waiting, the absence of a final killing blow. It gnawed at them, eroding their resolve like acid dripping onto raw flesh. A static-laced voice finally broke through the suffocating quiet. One of the bridge officers, his tone trembling with disbelief. "Commander, incoming transmission." Every officer turned as one, their eyes locking onto the communication array. A transmission? From the human warship? For a brief, fleeting moment, hope flickered in the depths of Vorkal's mind. Perhaps the humans would demand surrender. Perhaps there would be terms. Anything was better than this crushing, suffocating uncertainty. "Patch it through," he growled. The screen flickered. Then, darkness. No face. No insignia. No emissary. Just an empty black screen. Then finally, a voice. It was deep, calm, cold. It was a voice that did not boast, did not threaten. It simply stated fact. "You have been weighed, measured, found lacking." Every Zelthar officer stiffened. The words carried no anger, no hatred, only certainty, finality, like a judge passing sentence. The voice continued. This was a warning, not a victory, not a battle, a warning. A chill slithered down Vorkal's spine. "Next time we will not be so generous." And then, silence. The transmission cut out. Nothing remained on the screen but the black abyss of space. A warning. The meaning was clear. The Zelthar had been spared once, it would not happen again. For the first time in his life, Vorkal felt something foreign and repulsive curling in his gut. Fear. Real, raw, visceral fear. Not the fear of losing a battle. Not the fear of a superior opponent. But the fear of facing something beyond comprehension. Something the Dominion had no answer for. Something they could not stop. And if the humans had done this with a single warship, then what else were they capable of? He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to maintain his composure. His officers were watching him, waiting, hoping. Vorkal straightened in his seat, his gaze fixed on the dark void ahead. He could not let them see his hesitation, but deep inside, in a place no one else could see, he knew the truth. The Dominion's age of dominance was over. Humanity had arrived, and the galaxy would never be the same. The bridge of the Zelthar command vessel remained frozen in stunned silence. No one dared to speak. The transmission from the human warship had ended, but its echo lingered, like the reverberation of a distant thunderclap rolling across a battlefield after the first shot had been fired. Fleet Commander Vorkal sat motionless in his command seat, his sharp eyes locked onto the main view screen, where the dark, unyielding form of the human warship still loomed in the void. Silent, unmoving, waiting. For a species like the Zelthar, who had spent centuries crushing lesser civilizations beneath their war engines, this moment was beyond humiliation. It was a reckoning. They had been tested, and they had been found wanting. Not by overwhelming numbers. Not by a superior fleet. By one single warship. A warship that had not needed to scream its threats, nor flaunt its power with mindless destruction. It had simply demonstrated, and that demonstration had left the Dominion's finest fleet in shambles. One of the bridge officers, a veteran of countless conquests, swallowed hard and turned toward Vorkal. His voice trembled, an unthinkable thing for a Zelthar. "Warrior, see, commander, what are your orders?" Orders. Vorkal almost let out a bitter laugh. He knew what they wanted to hear. He could see it in their eyes. They wanted direction, a command to restore their shattered pride. But he had none to give. What could he say? Attack? No. That was suicide. Flee? They already had. And yet, the warship had not pursued. That alone was a message, a sign that the humans were in control. Try to negotiate? No. The message had been clear. There were no negotiations. There was only the next time, and next time, the humans would not be so merciful. For the first time in his life, Vorkal did something he had never imagined he would do. He stood from his throne, his massive form looming over the bridge. He exhaled slowly, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that could crush mountains. "We are leaving." He did not bark the order, did not snarl it like a wounded beast trying to reclaim its dominance. He simply accepted it. A sharp breath rippled through the bridge as the officers registered the words. Not retreat, not surrender, but acknowledgement. They had been defeated, without a single shot fired in return. The Zelthar fleet turned, their surviving warships limping away from the silent specter in the void. Their battered hulls, once symbols of fear and conquest, now symbols of failure. No pursuit, no final blow. The warship remained still, watching. And that was the worst part of all. Not the destruction, not the losses, but the knowing. Knowing that something far more powerful than them had taken notice, and chosen, for now, to let them live. Message echoes. Through the stars, the return of the fleet was a disaster unlike any in Zelthar history. Thousands of Dominion fleets had embarked on glorious campaigns before, returning home as conquerors. But this fleet returned in disgrace. Rumors spread like wildfire, slithering through the highest echelons of the Dominion. The soldiers who survived spoke in hushed tones. Veterans who had once spoken only of victory and slaughter now whispered of a shadow in the void, and worst of all, the message. That cold, merciless voice, repeating in their minds. You have been weighed, measured, found lacking. Even the High Council of the Dominion was shaken. The Zelthar prided themselves on their strength. Their fleets were their pride, their warriors their legacy. And yet, one single human warship had shattered their illusions. What if it was not alone? What if the humans had fleets of such warships? What if this was only the beginning? Paranoia seeped through the halls of the Dominion's ruling elite. The once unshakable certainty of Zelthar's superiority was crumbling. For the first time, the predators had become the prey, and the galaxy would soon hear of it. For the Zelthar were not the only empire watching. Other galactic civilizations had witnessed the Zelthar's once mighty war fleet limp home. They had seen the desperate attempts to hide the truth. But whispers carried through the stars. The name of the humans was spreading, and with it, a warning. Humanity had been quiet. Humanity had been patient. But now, the galaxy knew. Humanity was not to be underestimated. Humanity was not to be challenged. The next time the stars burned, it would be in the fires of a war that the Zelthar and the galaxy would never forget.